Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we will be reviewing the Guji, natural processed Ethiopia from Leuchtfeuer Coffee. And there's the bag right there. And Leuchtfeuer, based out of Wedel, Germany. And they were a suggestion to us by Yuliman, so shout out to and thank you to Yuliman for the suggestion. This is part one of a 4-part Leuchtfeuer series that will feature a bonus Friday video, as well as a special coffee on Saturday, so stay tuned for both of those. Now, Leuchtfeuer is a coffee roaster that I had zero familiarity with going into this series, and a lot of people know that when it comes to reviewing new coffee roasters, I like to review at least one non-washed offering. And when I was looking through their site, this is the only non-wash processed coffee that I felt like I might enjoy. So we will see how that turned out, as this right here is day 35. And recipe we went with for this coffee was Leuchtfeuer's recipe, which is a 15:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 93 degrees Celsius, about 199 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind. Roast profile for this coffee, even with the processing method, you can definitely tell that this one's a fair bit lighter than a lot of the coffees that we do review on this channel, which is saying something because we do review some very light coffees. I would say that this is very much in line with the Nordic roast profile. That's to say that this is pretty light by most standards and metrics. With that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 14, first impression, and ran it through the Chemex, and the cup was coming out cleaner than the average natural processed coffee, with a heavy focus and emphasis on the tropical fruits. From this first impression, I could pick out an almost banana-like vibrancy, complemented by melon, coconut, and a slight peachiness, with a fair bit of brightness as well. That definitely left a very positive first impression. I've been having some pretty good results with natural processed Ethiopian coffees this year. Day 16, ran it through the V60, and it was yet another positive day, as it continues to remain on the cleaner side of things, with no huge warning signs of potentially changing into a slightly less clean cup. Very tropical, bright, as it continues to offer so much of that fruit vibrancy, tropicality, with more of that banana-like quality. So yet again, another really positive day to the cup. Day 19, ran it through the April brewer, and it wasn't quite as enjoyable as it had been on previous days, as it was lacking the same level of clarity. So as mentioned, it's not something that I was too concerned about, given just how clean the first couple of days were. But with this adjustment, I could definitely feel perhaps a little bit of the natural progression of this coffee, as it didn't offer the same sort of clarity from the earlier days. Still a very tropical, vibrant cup with an emphasis on that melon and coconut-like aspect, so still a pretty nice coffee, if not quite as good as those first couple of tries. Day 22, back through the Chemex with an increased temperature, a little bit more fine grind, and interestingly enough, the coffee came out a little bit more muted. The most vibrant aspects were coming through in the finish, and while it still remained on the cleaner side, there was a lot of that tropicality coming through with a very defined melon, as well as a bit of pineapple. It opened up a fair bit as it cooled down. A good day, and this is a first opportunity to kind of discuss that. This is the first coffee I worked on. This is the one that had the latest roast date out of all of the coffees. That's to say that it was the one that was roasted the earliest among the 4 coffees that we're reviewing. And as a result, I didn't see that on their website they have brewing recommendations for all of their coffees. I was trying to find a brew guide for them. So the first adjustment I made was, hey, let's really push this one and see what happens with it. So that's something I will correct later within this coffee. But for these couple of days, you'll see that I attempted to go the other direction with this one, and on day 24 made the same adjustments. Vibrant components can be felt at the cost of clarity yet again. So those early days where I experienced so much clarity and cleanliness to the cup, not quite as present with the adjustments I had made, as there's a slight bit more of the fermentiness to complement that very strong tropicality to the cup. And also continue to focus on the bright citric aspects with slightly less of that berry component. So not necessarily my favorite. We continue on to day 27 as I adjusted it back to the original recipe. And it was worth noting that the cup had skewed a little bit more in the fermenty direction on its own with time, and the vibrancy that I had made with the adjustments had really increased. So there was a slight bit less clarity just in general with this cup. The best I had experienced of this coffee was those first couple of days. And while it still remained on the cleaner side relative to natural coffees, it was skewing a little bit more on that tropical vibrancy, as the listed papaya felt very fitting. More of the previously mentioned banana, but here on day 29, this is when I really discovered that they had their own brewing recommendations, and I finally made that adjustment, lowered the temperatures, and it was helping out a bunch in terms of the fermenting direction, as there was a long-lasting tropicality to the cup. Also on this day, the coffee felt the most well-defined it had been up to this point, with a focus on the melon and even a peachiness that I don't think I've mentioned too much throughout this review up to this point, but it was much more well-defined, much more pronounced. And on day 31, adjusted it one more time, this time through the Chemex, and the coffee is the best it has been to this point, and I think that was a natural progression. So with this slight adjustment, it was really good through both these brew methods. I feel like I was just getting a slight bit more vibrancy, a little bit more peachiness through the V60, which is why it was my preference. Reminiscent of the earlier days yet again, as it had more of the defined melon, some bright peach, but mostly a tropical citric forward cup. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. We have quite a few level 4s, so before we go through them, let me say one thing. I actually made 2 tasting wheels of this coffee and they turned out to the exact same, so I didn't realize that I had already made one, and I made a second one. And I think the finish I actually put at a level 5 for the other one, but everything else on that tasting wheel was the same, which I felt was kind of funny. But let's go through this one, and we will start with the finish, which is at a level 4. And I did mention that in the other tasting wheel, I pushed it all the way up to that level 5. Because it does have a surprisingly long-lasting finish, even for a natural processed coffee. I wouldn't say that it's overbearing in any sense, but it just has so many of those tropical components to it towards the end. Finish, level 4, correction, sweetness, level 4. Yes, it is a very sweet coffee, and it is a very fruit-sweet cup of coffee, and that was noticeable right from the start, and it was something that was persistent throughout the time drinking this. Acidity, level 4. Yes, that's another note that I mentioned pretty early on, that there was a lot of brightness within this cup. That was also something noticeable throughout the entirety of drinking it. So brightness, level 4, yes, definitely justified. Florality, level 4. I do believe that they have something listed as super floral. They do have super floral listed on the bag, and it's not something I've mentioned too much, mostly because there was a little bit more emphasis on the tropicality for me in this coffee, but even then, it did have a sweeter floral component to the cup, which isn't something I've mentioned too much, but definitely pretty well pronounced. I could see it still being justified at the level 4 mark. Prairie fruit, level 4. Yes, and that's 2 things. That's most specifically the melon, and it is also that banana-like attribute. It is interesting they don't have that listed on here. I don't think a lot of coffee roasters usually put that on there if there's no sort of like really boozy component to it. Because typically when I get banana in a coffee, it reminds me a little bit more of a rum-like attribute as opposed to a kind of defined fruit banana itself. So level 4, I feel like that's justified, and oftentimes the banana and coconut notes in coffee taste pretty similar to me. Citrus fruit, level 4, yes, I would say if anything that might be the most pronounced of the fruit characteristics in this one, mostly because of just how much brightness there was. I mentioned pineapple from time to time. It's a little bit more of a sweeter citric fruit to the cup. I'm trying to look what else they have on here. Yeah, the papaya, but even then, citrus fruit, level 4, feels pretty good to me. And then the stone fruit, level 4, I don't think I've mentioned it too much. There was much more of those sugary stone fruits present within this one for me. I was getting a little bit more of something like a mango as opposed to, well, actually, correction, I was getting a fair bit of that peach. I completely spaced on that one, but mango, peach, 2 things, but if anything, there were times that the peach was a little bit more pronounced within this cup. Then we have a couple of level 3s. We will start with the body at a level 3, and yes, it had a fair bit of texture to it. I don't think that there's too much to elaborate on that one. I think regardless of which brew method I went with, I was getting a fair bit of body. Could be attributed to the concentrated recipe we had at the 15-1. Nonetheless, fair bit of body in this one as well. And then last thing we must discuss, and probably the most important thing to discuss, is the cleanliness at a level 3. And one of the first notes I had when discussing this coffee was that this was a cleaner than expected or average natural processed coffee, and it was. And those first couple of days definitely kind of hinted at maybe getting that level 4. And working through this coffee, I think I got a slight graining quality on one day, and there was that fermenting quality I was getting for a number of days. So I feel like that really kind of played a role in how I finally charted the cleanliness. Even on the final days, I feel like it's on the higher side of level 3. It's definitely cleaner than the average natural processed coffee, but I always say if you can't justify it maybe being as clean as your standard wash processed coffee, then it's really hard to put it at that level 4 mark. So it's a high level 3, and I was really appreciative of the clarity that was offered within this coffee. Nonetheless, it still finishes within that range, and I feel like that's everything worth discussing in this tasting wheel. I feel like it's a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee, given that this is the only natural I'm going to have from this coffee roaster, at least this time around, I felt like it was pretty good. It definitely left a very positive first impression the first couple of times I tried it, and towards the end, once I was able to kind of readjust and bring it back to what I'd first experienced, it was a pretty good coffee. That being said, I've had a surprisingly good year when it comes to natural processed coffees, most specifically Ethiopian coffees. So this one right here isn't necessarily my favorite natural processed coffee I've had this year, not even my favorite natural processed Ethiopian coffee. But by most standards, I would say that this was on the more enjoyable side of things, and I liked the other coffees a little bit more than I like this one. This one probably was my least favorite, so if this is my least favorite of the 4 coffees that we're going to be reviewing from them, then I think that's a really good start, because I still felt like that this one was a pretty nice cup of coffee in general. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to, actually, this still remained on the cleaner side of naturals, and I keep wanting to emphasize that because people that like their more clean natural processed coffees with a little bit more definition to them, this is a good start on that. In addition to that, it did offer some wonderfully sweet tropical components to it, so if that's the type of naturals you gravitate towards a little bit more, then this one has that in significant abundance, complemented by a number of other fruit factors. You weren't lacking in the fruits, as all 3 of them scored at least that level 4 mark while still offering some great florality. I feel like this one could have been really special if I could have just gotten it up to that level 4 in terms of the clarity, but everything else really hit the mark for me. Great sweetness, above average clarity, fruits and floral components with a pretty noticeable and distinct flavor profile to it. So that's the type of person I would direct this to, and that's the best way I will leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Guji, Natural Processed Ethiopia from Leuchtfeuer. Thank you for watching.